Welcome. I am Louis Rickey, Executive Director of the Indiana Arts Commission. I am a white male, a little bit older, and I'm sitting in my office in my home, which is bright and sunny with a contemporary quilt behind me. Today, we're talking about rent, tenant rights, and more. For example, what happens when the eviction moratorium ends? What do we need to know about paying or collecting rent, tenant rights for arts organizations and independent creatives? This is the second of three webinars about legal issues in the arts during COVID 19. With me today are Paige Sharp and Scott Wiley. Paige and Scott, please introduce yourselves and give us an audio description of your appearance for anyone participating with low vision or blindness.
Thank you, Louis. I'm Paige Sharp, and I'm the Deputy Director of Programs with the Indiana Arts Commission. I am a middle-aged white woman with sandy blonde hair and some fabulously white reading glasses with a painting in the background. And I'm glad that you could join us today and learn from Scott about some real issues so many folks are facing. We know from our friends at the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority that there have been 25,000 applications for rental assistance. So this is very important and timely discussion. I want to let you know that if you did submit a question when you registered, we have that question and Scott will get to that. But please put comments in the comment boxes. They'll be fed to us, and I will help make sure at the end of Scott's conversation that he addresses any questions that you may have. We're broadcasting through YouTube today, and thank you so much everyone for joining us. Scott?
So nice for everyone to be here today. My name's Scott Wiley. I'm an attorney. I run Pro Bono Indiana and the Volunteer Lawyer Program in Evansville, Indiana. I'm a white male, and I am more than middle-aged unless I can live to be 114. I am in front of a contemporary painting. That's one of my favorites in my home. And I'm wearing a purple check shirt. So welcome to everyone today. And what we're going to talk about today very broadly is the housing and eviction and mortgage foreclosure risks that many of our colleagues in the creative community and the arts are going to face in the next several months because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to talk about housing and commercial spaces very broadly, inclusive of not only renters, but also landlords. Since many of our gallery owners and others may actually also be landlords in the sense they may rent to a gallery or have other arrangements where they deal with rental issues. So this isn't just about eviction. It'll be a little broader than that, but it is going to be an important discussion. Not all of the subject matters that I discussed today are going to affect each of you individually. You may have an artist loft where you do both work and live. And so eviction may be the only subject matter I talk about that is directly related to you, and you may not have any commercial issues. I'm going to talk about everything though broadly, hoping that you will serve as ambassadors of this information to your friends and colleagues in the creative community to try to make sure that we are as supportive as one another as we possibly can be during this terrible time. So it will be very important that you first understand that we are dealing with something that the courts and that Indiana's housing system has not dealt with before, at least not since 1918. And that is a very sudden and severe pandemic that has resulted in the potential loss of much of the rental housing that we have. Because of the fact that we wanted to make sure that during our stay-at-home orders and while people were not allowed to work because of the pandemic, Governor Holcomb issued a rent moratorium, as most governors across the United States did. And that prohibited landlords from filing and pursuing eviction matters against renters during the period of the moratorium. The federal government issued a similar moratorium involving federally subsidized housing. So if you receive Section 8 assistance or other rental assistance for your unit or your home, there are slightly separate, different rules, as there always are with federally subsidized housing. Unfortunately, the moratoriums that protected individuals from being removed from their homes ended at midnight on Friday of last week, and Governor Holcomb has not extended that moratorium. Complicating that a bit further was the moratorium on utility cutoffs for most utilities in the state of Indiana ended on July 31st, or at the same time, the rental moratorium ended, depending on who your provider of gas, electric, water, sewer are. And so we are now also facing the potential of cutoffs of utilities and collection actions involving back due rent and back due utilities. We may have individuals, colleagues of ours, who have to decide whether to pay their rent in order to maintain their tenancy or pay their utilities to keep their lights on, and maybe not both. And the assistance places where we go to try to get help with all these are bifurcated and distributed across the state in a not too terribly organized way, although it is getting better. But all these things have been put together so quickly that there are lots of unintended consequences. So that's not quite as if you had seen my presentation a couple of weeks ago. I was a little funnier and smiled a little more. This one's a little more serious, and we want to get you the best information we possibly can. So let's start out with the basics of the rental relationship and eviction. Basically, what I'm going to talk about is eviction that is the result of the fact that you are unable or are behind on the payment of rent. That is not the only reason people are evicted in Indiana. And in fact, people are evicted for a variety of reasons: violation of their rental agreement, the inappropriate addition of additional tenants within a unit, the wasting of the unit by doing damage or other things to the unit, rental disputes over conditions and habitability. But I'm going to focus primarily on the crisis that's in front of us, which is primarily for the inability to pay rent. So when that happens, the normal process is the landlord will provide the tenant with a notice that they're behind on their rent. You've probably gotten one of these if you ever went to college or were a little bit late, like I was several times. And that's usually a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. And that is the notice that's most typically used. Right now, many of us may be far more than 3 days behind. I met with a client this weekend who had not been able to pay rent since March. And so there are people out there across the spectrum, a few weeks behind to a few months behind. Once that notice is done, if you're not able to come current with your rent, then the landlord is authorized to file an eviction action. That's an old-fashioned legal word, we call it replevin. It's to get your property back. And so that is a 2-step process usually. The landlord will file an eviction, and a hearing will be scheduled within about a week or two after they file. And that first hearing will deal solely with the return of possession of the unit to the landlord. That's meaning you're going to get kicked out. And once that hearing is held, and if the eviction moves forward and is granted, then you will typically have a period of a few days to exit the unit before your local sheriff department will come to remove you and padlock the facility. So after that, 2 or 3 weeks later, there'll be a second hearing, which you must go to or you'll get really screwed. And that's called a rent and damages hearing. And that's where the court then determines the financial obligations between the parties. When the landlord files for eviction, the landlord has no idea what the ultimate amount of rent and damages and other things are. You haven't had the court hearing. The attorney hasn't sent the fee to the landlord for doing the eviction. They don't know if the unit's damaged. So that hearing 2 or 3 weeks later determines that financial arrangement. When landlords file for eviction, they typically do so in small claims court, which has a jurisdictional maximum of $6,000 plus attorney's fees and costs. When they file for eviction, if I'm a landlord and I'm smart, I file and say, hi, I want to evict Bob. I'm said Bob owes me $6,000 plus fees, the actual amount to be proven at our hearing. And then I go to the eviction and I get my unit back. And then we have the rent and damages 2 or 3 weeks later, and Bob doesn't come to his hearing. because Bob's been evicted and he doesn't even remember that it was discussed, and he doesn't even remember the judge said you got to be back here in 3 weeks. He's just been evicted and he's lost his housing and he's all upset. And because he doesn't appear, there is no proof at hearing. There is nothing to argue over at hearing. The court just gives a default judgment to the landlord for $6,000 plus attorney's fees and costs, even if Bob just owed $500. So now Bob's not only going to have an eviction on his record, he's going to have a $7,000 or $8,000 judgment against him, and eventually we'll have a bankruptcy filing that will cost society even more. So if you or a colleague or a friend is in risk of eviction, make sure they go to all of their hearings. So that's the basic process in normal times. Right now, the court is working to add a third step, which is at the beginning of the eviction process, hoping to encourage landlords and tenants to step out and attempt to come to a voluntary agreement beforehand, and to utilize the rental assistance programs that have been developed and are available to try to save people's tenancies. According to the Census Department, as many as 20 to 30% of renters in the United States are at least 1 month behind on their rent. That could be as many as 30 million tenancies that are at risk right now, and that's tens of thousands of Hoosiers that may be at risk of losing their rental housing as well. So getting that information out to people that they should seek rental assistance. If they are facing an eviction, they must go to all their hearings to reduce the economic destruction as much as we possibly can for each and every one of our colleagues. So just a mention about some of the rental assistance programs. If you are facing eviction, talk to your landlord. In normal times, if you get behind, when I was in college and I was behind on my rent, if I didn't pay it, my landlord would have probably been thrilled to get rid of me, because there would have been another student who was perhaps a little bit more ambitious than I was to fill that unit and pay the rent. Right now, landlords don't have that. When landlords pay a bunch of money to an attorney to evict a tenant, they're likely to find that the tenant who used to only be able to pay half their rent is replaced with no tenant, because there are so few people that are going to be in the position of moving back into relatively low income housing because of the pandemic and the fact that they don't have money either. So the fact that there are chances for landlords to get paid part or all of their rent for several months may be worthwhile for them. The major program, which is available through indianahousingnow.org, that's the portal, indianahousingnow.org. That's the portal for our state housing department and the state's program that's paid for with CARES Act funds to provide rental assistance to individuals who are behind because of COVID-19. That program can provide up to $500 of rental assistance for 4 months, for a total of $2,000 of rental assistance. And over that period, the landlord and the tenant must apply for it together. And they must agree, the landlord agrees not to remove the tenant, and the tenant agrees to allow the money to go directly to the landlord. So this is money that goes directly into the landlord's account. It never goes to the tenant. So there's no risk of a landlord being cheated out of the money by a tenant who receives the aid but doesn't pass it on to the landlord. This is one of the most effective tools, as Paige mentioned already. Nearly 30,000, I think it was 27,000 something was the last number I heard. People have applied. My understanding as well is the fund is almost completely exhausted already. It is our hope that the state will add additional funds, and that when the federal government finally comes to a pandemic relief agreement in the next few weeks, hopefully, if not within the next few months, that those funds will be replenished. So please apply even if you hear that the fund is temporarily exhausted. The same thing happened with the PPP program, the payroll protection program that provided assistance to small businesses. It ran out of money in approximately 6 days. But after being out of money for a few days, it was refunded sufficiently to provide small businesses across the country additional relief. So please, please, please apply for that aid. That is the most generous program in the state. Not everyone will qualify. You can only be behind so much. You must have the ability to pay part or all your rent going forward. There are rules and regulations, but do go to it. It is the most generous program. And applying, while it may not mean you will get it, at least you're in line in case you do qualify. In most of our major cities in Indiana, Evansville, South Bend, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, those cities are large enough to be recipients of CDBG funds, and most of those cities received CARES Act money through the CDBG program that can be used for rental assistance as well. And so many of our larger cities and towns have their own rental assistance programs they're using to supplement the state program. So be sure and check in your local community if you have any local funds. Most are run through the Homeless Service or Community Development Department within your local community. In Evansville, for example, we got just under $1 million dedicated to rental assistance. Our city is going to use it for homelessness prevention to try to keep people housed as long as we possibly can until they can get additional rental assistance and other programs. Your local community may be using it in a variety of other ways. These funds may also be helpful for utility assistance, another huge concern, because keeping your apartment but not having electricity, water, heat, or air conditioning can make that an uninhabitable unit. So those programs may also be available to assist with utility payments. Of course, all of our communities still have the same old-fashioned help that's always been there in times of need, going to your minister, going to the township trustee, going to the church charities, going to all those places. The challenge with many of this is trying to hobble together enough resources to protect the tenancy and keep your lights on. And many of these programs, especially with the federal program that's funded, the state is funded primarily federal money. Some of them, if you're lucky enough to get $100 from one place, it reduces your other by $100. So sometimes they don't work well together. So try with the state program first and then go from there. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the other self-help things that you can do in an eviction crisis. And that is talk to the landlord. And if you are not going to be able to salvage the tenancy, if you do not have the financial resources and you do not have the prospects of returning to employment with sufficient income to do so, talk to the landlord about a voluntary exit from the tenancy. Voluntary exit means that you agree to leave within a certain specified amount of time and may even agree to some type of financial arrangement to pay your landlord back eventually, but doing so outside of the court involvement and without an eviction. Evictions are on public records. All civil actions in Indiana, with rare exceptions such as child issues and other things, are public record, which means before any landlord rents to any tenant, they can run your name through the list and find out if you have evictions or other collection actions like utility collection actions against you. That can put you on a really not too subtle blacklist that will keep you from getting good quality housing. So if sometimes there's an incentive, oh, well, I'll just wait till the legal process is over. It gets me an extra 6 weeks. I'm just going to do that. Then I'm just going to have the eviction. They'll drag me out of here. That may have made sense in some periods of time. It doesn't make sense now. This is a terrible time to have that on your record. And landlords have a greater incentive to consider allowing voluntary exits and surrender of the housing. So consider that. Landlords are much more amenable to having these conversations right now than during a normal trial. And I want to talk about another thing before I talk a bit about commercial and what you're doing if you're a gallery owner or an arts organization. And that is, do not attempt without legal guidance from either your local legal aid or pro bono program or through contacting the intake process on the flyer for these sessions as well. Do not try to do self-help. Oftentimes when people are behind on their rent, they believe they get some type of secret ability to save the tenancy because the landlord didn't fix the lock, or the furnace has been broke for 3 days, or I asked to have the dripping faucet repaired a month ago and the landlord's not done anything. The reality is that old-fashioned, I withhold my rent because my landlord isn't upholding their part of the bargain, only works if you know how to do that. It requires legal notices. It requires sophisticated communications with the landlord. It just doesn't work. The second you don't pay your rent, the landlord can evict you. And habitability issues and other defenses of that nature may be helpful in your rent and damages hearing. But when you get to that eviction hearing, the only question the judge is going to ask is, have you paid your rent? And if the answer is no, you're saying, well, the reason I didn't pay the rent, ... The reason I didn't agree to that, ... becomes defenses for your rent and damages hearing, and it will unlikely save the tenancy. Usually you have to get in with those suits before the eviction is filed to have them be effective. So do not let old wives' tales or people in the community tell you, oh, just say, you know, the air conditioner's been broken for a month. Well, that's why I didn't pay the rent. Don't fall for that. And if you have done that, seek out legal aid assistance to get guidance on how to either cure that or fix it or get back, unless you're just going to be evicted and then you want to try to minimize the damage to that as much as you possibly can. So again, if you have a live workspace or you are dealing with this in your housing issue, that's the basics of eviction. IndianaHousingNow.org is where the rental assistance is located. Just might mention as well, there may be a pre-eviction mediation program created by the state courts and the state housing department that has not been implemented yet, but please keep your eye out for that. Your local court will begin to follow that if the Supreme Court issues an order that that's to do. That's, again, another chance, hopefully, before the housing is removed, to make sure you got a chance to try to get rental assistance or cure or do something else. What if you are actually facing this happening and you've actually been evicted? The first thing I want you to do if you are facing an eviction hearing is make sure you go through your home and your workspace and get everything that is important and meaningful that you must have out of that space. Your prescription medication, your important papers, your contracts, your agreements, if you have expensive material that you use to create your art, if you have pictures of your grandmother, whatever is meaningful that you must get out, make sure you get that out and get that into the trunk of your car or in a box or somewhere else. Because what's going to start happening is the sheriff is going to be overwhelmed. And if they come 6 hours early or they come a day late, we're not going to know it. Once they come, they padlock your house. And if you come back in or try to get back in, they will arrest you as trespassers. The landlord must keep. So if you can't get your furniture out and you can't get some things out, the landlord has to store it for at least 45 days. You have the right to get it back. You do have to pay a storage fee, but you will be able to retrieve. So if you can't get out a couch or you can't get out a really heavy table, you know, the one thing you just have to make sure you've got your stuff out so you don't miss your prescription medication, your insulin, anything of the thing that you must have. So there you go with that. I want to talk just briefly now, and then I'll give a few scenarios, and then we'll take some questions that Paige can help me do. And that is, what am I do if I'm a gallery or I'm a renter in that nature? If I'm in a commercial space. Commercial space rules are a little different. You don't have rental assistance. You don't have a lot of the programs designed to help low-income people. So if you're in a commercial facility, you want to make sure you look at your lease and what notice and other requirements are available. This is not a good time if I'm a commercial landlord to evict my gallery tenant because no one is coming to follow you. So have a conversation with your commercial landlord to make sure that you can stay. Make payment arrangements, do what you have to do to try to have that conversation. Commercial notice periods are often different than residential notice periods, and you'll need to look at your lease to see what type of notice and other things they have to terminate your commercial tenancy. The eviction process is pretty much the same in terms of between a commercial and another, but I just wanted to mention that for those of you who are renting gallery space or other things and you're dealing with a commercial landlord from your work life versus your home work life in a home or work creation space. So And unfortunately, as I mentioned, not much help there other than contacting your local SBDC, Small Business Development Center, or other economic development program in your community. Many of them are helping to facilitate some of the federal programs through the SBA and other programs you might be available for assistance, like the PPP program that helped keep many arts organizations afloat and with their staff in place. So be sure to do that. So a couple of things I want to mention in addition to those normal processes and the depressing things that I've just gone over. Some other things going on. One of the real challenges of this is not just a pandemic that is affecting low-income individuals and artists that are in work-live spaces. It's affecting everybody. And so with all of us that can't pay our rent, that means that our apartment owner can't pay their mortgage. And so we have a lot of apartment owners and duplex owners and people who depend upon the rent that all of us pay to pay their mortgage. And unlike the rental assistance programs that exist, there are virtually no mortgage assistance programs. There is some money left from 2008's crisis for private homeowners for mortgage foreclosure, and do look into that at the housing department, the Indiana Housing Department, if you are a homeowner and you're facing mortgage foreclosure. A little bit of help left there, but for commercial owners, there's virtually no help. So if someone owns a duplex that is not their primary residence, or they own an apartment complex or other things, or they're a commercial building owner that you rent your gallery from, or the space that you sell your art from, those folks aren't getting help, and they aren't getting rent, and they are facing the same types of crisis that the housing eviction is, which means you may get here, my landlord is being foreclosed upon and the bank has taken over our building. What do we do? Just want to assure everyone, if someone buys either the commercial space you rent from or buys the house or the apartment that you rent in privately, your rental agreements remain in place. You will not lose your tenancy because the owner of the facility goes belly up or has to sell the facility. Now, here's the risk with that, which is why I mentioned this as part of an eviction foreclosure discussion. If you are on a month-to-month tenancy, or you are a short period of time away from the end of your present tenant period, a new owner may not want to keep you, especially if you are behind on your financial obligation. So you may want to look at your rental agreement if you're a private renter, or your commercial agreement if you are renting from a commercial owner, and see when the end of your current tenancy is and what renewal rights your current contract give you. That allows you to just plan for the potential, if your landlord does not renew, that you'll have adequate time to deal with the moving of your workspace, your living space, or if you rent from a commercial owner, something of that. So the other thing I did want to mention, and then we'll take questions, is that what happens if my commercial landlord or the owner of the apartment or home I rent and do my live work creation in comes to me and says, I need to sell because I don't have any money, and I need you to leave so that I can sell this unit. A lot of times people have trouble selling an apartment building, a duplex, or a commercial building if the tenant they have in is currently not paying rent. There's a percentage analysis that's done on the value of the property based on the percentage of tenancy that is being paid. So if you have 4 apartments and 2 people of the 4 are unable to pay their rent, the tenancy percentage is 50%, and that person will lose gazillions of dollars of value if they do. So if you are behind on your rent and the owner of the facility comes to you and says, I need you to leave because I've got to sell the building because you're not paying rent and I don't have money and I'm going to get foreclosed on. If that would happen, that puts you in a very good negotiating position to try to get out of obligation you have in exchange for your willingness to voluntarily exit the unit. Much like voluntarily exiting to avoid an eviction, the voluntary exit in this circumstance excuse me, can help you avoid a financial obligation. So that's the major pieces I wanted to go over. In the announcement for these webinars, there is an intake telephone number if you're having a specific issue that we will try to get you to someone who can answer your specific tenancy issue. That's in the announcements for all three of these webinars. We'll be working on employment and employment-related issues at our next one. But if you have a specific question on your own specific interest, I really encourage you to use that opportunity to seek that kind of assistance rather than attempt to use this general communal world to do it. But if you have any general questions on issues that I haven't touched on, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And Paige has been monitoring and will hopefully be able to give me anything else that we have coming in so far. I just want to let everybody know, and usually Paige and I, when we do these, we're happy and fun, and all the reviews come back and say, well, my goodness, what jovial people, and they seem to really love what they do. This is not very happy information. And we have a lot of our colleagues in the arts and the creative community that are always, no one goes in to this work to become really rich. Some of us get to be, the person behind me did very well, but not all of us do. And many of our colleagues work very hard. They love their art so much that they're willing to live with a relatively low income. And because of that, they're much more at risk of losing housing, losing their workspace, losing the ability to do stuff. So get this information out to your colleagues and friends. If you're a quilter and you have lots of folks that do fabric work, tell your group. If you're a three-dimensional artist and you've got a lot of glass guys that you work with, then tell them because there's going to be help, and there's going to be help for a little while. And it's going to be really overwhelming. And the sooner we get people in and the sooner we get people thinking about these issues, not doing what we a lot of times do, which is put the bill that they're going to unhook my power in the corner and it'll just go away if I leave it over there for long enough. That's what I did in college, which, by the way, I probably lost my power 2 or 3 times in college and had to pay the fee. So that happens to all of us. But get this information out to your friends and colleagues best you can.
Scott, I so appreciate how clear you are about all of this. It's extremely helpful, I think, because in particular, this is a very hard time for lots of people. I went through it years ago, 2008, and lost my home. So one thing I want to tell people is that you will get through this. You will get through this. You can. You'll get to the other side. It will be okay. I'm so grateful to have Scott and the Lawyers for the Arts in Indiana to help support folks out there, because that help is so valuable, particularly when the expenses associated with are already so high. That there are people out to support you is so important. Scott, you may have touched upon this, so I apologize if I missed it. But in terms of the timeline, when a landlord provides notification that they're going to be evicted, the tenant's going to be evicted, how soon after that do they have to leave? And I say that twofold, because I also know from my personal experience that foreclosure, at least where I was located, which is the surrounding Chicagoland region, which is one of the most highly affected, that foreclosure rate took about a year to occur. So what do you kind of see right now? And what do you see down the pipeline?
That's and this is great information to get out. And by the way, I'll just mention really briefly, we didn't spend nearly as much time talking about people that are losing their homes or might lose their home because they can't pay their mortgage. That is a much, much longer process. And banks have a huge incentive not to foreclose on people right now. So if you're in that position, you're going to have many, many months before this is going to start coming. And then once it does come, opportunities to negotiate with your bank and do lots of things. So that's going to be way down the road. So let's focus real quick on the more immediate and scarier thing, which is the eviction, either from a work-live space or your private home or apartment. What you will find is I'm going to give you 2 timelines. I'm going to give you the timeline that if it works lickety-split in the way it works normally, and then I'm going to give you the timeline that it's likely to be during COVID. So let me give you the first one. The first one, our laws in Indiana, this is not shocking and it's not a political statement, but we live in a very conservative state, and our laws are written to very much favor property owners who have substantial property, and it is designed to protect wealth of people who own large amounts of property. Not surprising. If we were in New York or California, I would be saying we live in a state that's very tenant friendly and puts lots of extra protections in. It hate to use it, it is what it is. That's my shade for Michelle Obama, I guess. So in Indiana, what that means is our eviction process is fairly precipitous and fairly quick. And it's quicker in rural areas than it is in urban areas. And that is not because urban areas wouldn't like to kick you out real quick. It's that the volume is such that the courts are more backed up in our urban areas. So take this with a grain of salt in the sense that if you are in a rural area, you will be removed much more quickly than if you're in Evansville or Indianapolis or South Bend, just because of the way the courts work. So after you get your notice that you're behind on your rent, that's the key to the kingdom to allow the landlord to file the eviction action. Usually once that's filed, meaning, so let's say that your rent is due on the 1st, and on the 3rd, the landlord gives you a notice that says you are late. You have 3 days to cure, or I'm going to file an eviction. 3-day notice to quit. You don't pay, and it's now the 6th. And on the 7th, the landlord goes down to the courthouse and files an eviction. Landlord will be given a hearing usually within 10 to 12 days after that. I think that will be, here's your alternative. I think during COVID, I think it's going to get longer and longer in our urban areas because of the volume. But that usually about that quick. And then at that hearing, they determine typically whether or not possession of the unit is to be returned. So let's say we had 12 days on the 6th, you're now to the 18th of the month. So you didn't pay your rent on the 1st, by the 18th, theoretically, you might be facing that eviction. And then if that goes into effect, usually 3 to 5 days, depending on whether you land on a weekend or something, the sheriff's going to come and padlock you. So you could be out by the end of the month. So you're talking about a very quick process, which is why, as I mentioned, it's so important to get your important papers, your prescriptions, your other things in a safe place. Now, with all of those timeframes, especially during the first 2 or 3 months of this, I think you'll see extended timeframes. And if the court issues the guidance to do the mediation program first, you will find that when you arrive at your hearing after the notice, that 16th or 18th of the month, what the judge is likely to do is stand up in front of you and say, Paige, would you and the landlord please go outside in the hallway and talk to the court staff member or the help desk about the programs and things that are available to see whether or not you could arrange and agree to talk about saving the tenancy. In some cases, the landlord tenant will do that. In some cases, the landlord would be willing to do it, but the tenant's not there because they've given up. Sometimes the tenant will be there and the landlord has been wanting to get that person out for 2 years and isn't going to talk to anybody. But if they're willing, there may be the chance to delay it even further. So that a lot of times depends on your relationship with your landlord, your willingness to be flexible, and other things. In that discussion in the hallway, by the way, also the reason the court's considering that is that's also going to give the court the possibility of assisting people to determine voluntary surrenders so they can remove the eviction and indicate the person surrendered the premises so that person won't have an eviction legally on their thing. So the time frame is you could be looking as short as a month. I think on average what people look at is somewhere between 3 and 5 weeks if a landlord knows how to do it and does it right. Now, many of you who are on this call or watching this webinar may also have the kind of landlords that many live-work artists have. And that's the old guy who inherited it 40 years ago, who doesn't know what in the world to do when it's time to evict or do a lease or do anything else because it's just this old house he rents. Go to Bloomington. Half the houses up there, there's not even a lease because it's just a wacky place where people don't follow rules. In those cases, you may be able to stay longer only because your landlord may not know the procedural things to do with the court. Don't depend upon that. Just don't. And if you're a landlord, get legal help to do it right. You don't want to end up inadvertently depriving someone of their tenancy, and then you get a wrongful eviction action against you from a legal aid group or somebody else. So this is a time to reach out and be kind. Be sorry if you can't pay your rent and understand the position your landlord's in. Kindness to each other goes a long way right now. I will tell you, going to your landlord and crying about how sorry you are you can't pay your rent and how you know it's causing them great deep hurt will go a lot farther than saying, well, you just go ahead and try to evict me. You haven't fixed the air conditioner. This is a time where I'm really encouraging everyone involved, landlords and tenants, commercial landlords and people who occupy their spaces, that this is not a time to end your tenancy unless that is the only possible way to solve. And, some of us got to get to a day of reckoning. We can't keep digging ourselves in a hole. If you can't afford $1,200 a month anymore, don't keep waiting. Get out. If all you can afford now is $600, go find a roommate and get a shotgun house. This is, we want you to fix this. So day of reckonings can be helpful sometimes, but that's the kind of time frame people are looking at, Paige.
That's pretty fast,
Yeah,
really.
very fast.
And I can see how the domino effect will really hit a lot of communities, particularly where the unemployment is significant as a result of maybe a closure of a larger manufacturing firm of some sort. So we don't actually have any questions, and I'm kind of not surprised because you were extremely thorough and very articulate and comprehensive, and I so appreciate that.
Not a hat rack, not a hat rack.
I can see why you're such a man in demand to provide information, because it's so nice that it's clear and it's not in this crazy lawyer speak that quite frankly is very difficult to follow. But I do want to give people a heads up that you will be back here via Zoom webinar or through YouTube August 26th, which I believe is a week from today at 4 p.m. as well, talking about unemployment from an attorney's point of view. Do you want to unpack that a little bit, what you're going to be talking about?
Well, one of the things that COVID has done is it's affected the employment relationship for people dramatically, and not just unemployment. Don't come back if you're still employed and you think, oh, I don't need to do that because I don't need to know about unemployment insurance. That's not all it's about. That's part of it. And I'm hoping, wouldn't it be nice if we had pandemic unemployment returned by the federal government by then, but I don't think it's going to happen. But there are a number of changes to our employment rules if you are impacted by COVID, if you get sick, Family Medical Leave Act, protections of your position and your job, what happens if you're quarantined. There are a whole bunch of things that are added in terms of protections, additional sick and vacation time, other things that you can learn about both for yourself and for if you work with an arts organization. By the way, encourage your arts organizations that you work with. That will be one that will be much more relevant to them. They may not have thought eviction was something they needed to worry about, but how they deal with the employment issues. And that's what we'll be looking at the next one. And then who knows, depending on what keeps coming up in this crisis, we may do additional webinars on things that are relevant to the arts community and what you're seeing. So be sure, of course, as well as we do these, if you see legal issues that we're not effectively addressing to get information out, be sure and tell your IAC contacts and other folks so that we can try to do those in the future.
Yes, echo that, definitely. We want to hear from you. How can we help you all? So definitely let us know. And, if you think it'd be good to have Scott for a little coffee hour in the morning and you just throw out some questions, we can consider that too. We're really here to help you in the best way that we can. You are so important to us. You are so important as artists and organizations in the state of Indiana. We value you so much. Scott, I don't see any more questions, and I just want to tell you again how much I appreciate you and thank you. I think we go ahead and close out a little bit early, which is fine. Everybody gets on with their evenings. Thank you so very much. Appreciate your time.